Hello, hello. Welcome to Magic Like This, a C.S. Lewis book club podcast. I'm your host, Christina Wallace, and I just wanted to do a little bit of a recap of what we're doing this season in case you're new here. We're currently reading the Screwtape Letters, which is a fictional book written by C.S. Lewis, and the structure of it is a series of letters written by Uncle Screwtape to his nephew, Wormwood. And these two characters are actually demons, and the topic of all their letters is looking at the various ways that these demons can tempt a particular patient, otherwise known as a particular human that's been assigned to Wormwood, and to tempt them into eternal damnation and essentially the art of pulling them away from a relationship with God. It's a really fascinating structure that explores apologetics and theology and just our basic humanity. And we are looking at letter number 5 today. If you've been with me for a while, you'll know that I always say this letter's kind of heavy. I think the whole book is kind of heavy, but this particular letter felt too heavy for me to address on my own, because it particularly looks at the elements of building up or tearing down our faith during times of war, which, given the current climate in the world right now, and to be totally honest, I think given the current climate in the world always, in various parts of the world, it was too heavy for me to address on my own. We are so poignantly aware of the reality of suffering, particularly in times of war, and I didn't feel equipped to tackle that on my own. So I'm actually joined by a guest this episode, and you'll recognize, if you've been listening for a while, another Australian accent. If you heard my episode with Bex a few weeks ago, this is actually her dad who's joining me. I didn't plan this, it just worked out that way because Steve not only has a background in theology, having attended Bible college, but he also has 40 plus years of career experience, having worked in the military in Australia. And I just felt like that unique background was perfect to speak to some of the content of this letter. So I really hope that you enjoy our chat. Just a reminder that if you have been enjoying book club, there's a couple of things. You've got a menu of options of things that you can do to just enhance your book club experience, and also some things that I'd be really grateful if you did so that we can share this podcast with more people. First of all, I would just be oodles and oodles of gratitude if, that's not a grammatically correct sentence, but we're going to roll with it, if you would like and subscribe on whatever podcast app you use. If you would leave a review on Apple Podcasts, that would be like extra magical. See what I did there? And also, you can join us on social media. I'm particularly active on Instagram, but I also hang out a bit on YouTube, and we're on Pinterest, and I would love for you to kind of hang out with us in those spaces. But the best place to hang out with us is actually in the book club community on Substack. We have deep chats, we have lighthearted chats, we talk about our favorite hot drinks in winter, and we also talk about things like the heaviness of how do we know that God is good in seasons of suffering. So it's a whole myriad of conversations, and I'm really excited about what this community is becoming and will become. It's £5 a month to join in order to engage in all of the extended conversations, and there's also exclusive podcast episodes that are only available to paid book club members. However, you can also join for free to get my weekly newsletter, which gives you a bit more of a personal background into where my heart was in building the content for each week's episode. And so there's a little bit of heartfelt storytelling in there of where my personal experience is meeting the interpretation of these letters, which I think is really important. You know, we all read letters by bringing our background and experience, not even letters, but literature in general. We read by bringing our background and experience to the book, and that's why people interpret books differently. I have a master's in literature and creative writing, and we could all write an essay about a book and come to different conclusions because we bring our life stories to it. So those newsletters are a way of sort of inviting you into the intimacy of interpreting literature And I would really love if you wanted to hang out there with us. Like I said, the newsletters are totally free, or you can join the paid community for £5 a month and enjoy exclusive content, additional podcast episodes, conversations. I'm really excited, even though this community is relatively new, the way that it's building and what I hope to build is something of rich intimacy and also playfulness and fun. And I just really want to give a space to people, whether you are a Christian or not. If you're exploring tough questions, if you've got a tough story with faith, I want this to be a place where you can come just as you are and experience a breath of fresh air through the gift of literature in exploring who God is or who he might be. So if that is something that interests you at all, head on over to magiclikethis.substack.com and you can join either as a paid member in the community or you can choose the free subscription option. Equally, you can just hang out with us on socials. We're on Instagram at Magic Like This Podcast. We're on YouTube. We're on Pinterest, all of those places. So I hope to see you there. But I've been waffling enough. So why don't we get into the episode now and meet Steve?
Steve, can you just introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background with us?
Sure, Christina. It's great to be with you. I was born in the early 1950s in Australia, as you probably tell by my accent, just around about 9 years after the end of the Second World War. So the war that that Lewis talks about in this book today is very much familiar to me as a young boy. I grew up with all the stories from there. I joined the Air Force and served in the military for 48 years. And there I spent 30 years full-time and 18 years part-time. During one of the part-time episodes, I took a break as well as working part-time. I studied part-time and obtained a Bachelor of Theology in the Baptist Theological College in Victoria in Australia. So that's a quick summary of my career. As a career, I was an engineer in the Air Force, basically looking after aircraft maintenance primarily.
Wow. My grandpa, who passed when I was just a little girl, he was an engineer in the U.S. Air Force, which is kind of cool.
That's lovely.
Okay, so I want to just drive. I just want to give context to everyone. There's a time difference. Steve's joining us from Australia, and I'm here in the UK, and it's morning, and I haven't been awake for very long. So my articulation will improve the more sips of coffee that I have. I want to dive straight into this letter, and the reason that I wanted Steve to join me to discuss this one is the minute I opened it and started reading through, I did not feel equipped to discuss this on my own because the topic is so heavy, and I know every letter has been heavy in some context, but most of the letters have been heavy in a personal sense, and this is heavy on a global scale because the topic is essentially the various ways that we can either grow in our faith or lose our faith in wartime and in times of suffering and in times where we are faced with the reality of our own death. And that all just felt like too much for me to tackle on my own. And so I wanted Steve to join because he not only has a theology background, but he has a background in the military, which as we were speaking over email, Steve, you said, I never had to be in direct conflict, but I had to be faced with the reality that my career was involved in, the potential of having to take a life if it came to it. And how did I feel about that? I've never had to face that. I've been a teacher and a copywriter, and that's not a reality that I have to think about every day. And it really, I imagine, would have impacted just the way that you came to God and understood your faith and what it meant to follow Jesus while in a military type career.
Yeah, bit of background. I grew up in a Christian family and I joined the military as a Christian, which a lot of people may be surprised at, particularly if they have a very view of the military being just about killing people. But I'll maybe talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. But the idea of the Australian military is very much a defence force, not going out trying to kill people just for the sake of killing people in some kind of imperial way of imposing our will on the rest of the world. but rather as defending those who needed defending, and obviously primarily our own country, but also those around the world that were in need of that defence. So that's just a quick background. I can talk, if you like, about my own view about killing people. I can do that now if you like, or I can leave it a bit later, whichever you prefer.
I think we'll go. Steve and I have done a lot of prep here. We've got a nice list of questions that we want to work through from this letter, and so I think we'll chat about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Because it's quite relevant as we work our way through the letter. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull up the questions that we've got, and as always, I'm going to open my copy of Screwtape. So the first thing that we wanted to look at was kind of this overarching theme of how fear impacts faith. And the first few pages of this letter to from Screwtape to Wormwood is a lot of what feels to me like quite self-indulgent on Screwtape's part, but it's Lewis very cleverly setting up more of the character of who these devils are and how they feed off of people's fear and suffering. And so I just wanted to kind of look at that concept of how does fear impact our faith. And, Screwtape says things like, of course, a war is entertaining. The immediate fear and suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers. But what permanent good does it do us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? When I see the temporal suffering of humans who finally escape us, I feel as if I had been allowed to taste the first course of a rich banquet and then denied the rest. And he goes on to basically talk about how the enemy, i.e. God, is prepared to meet us in our times of fear. But then Screwtape is also acknowledging that fear can successfully draw souls into, the kingdom of his Father below. So, Steve, what do you think about that kind of overarching theme of how fear can touch our faith and mold it and change it?
One of the things that I believe very strongly is one of the big opposites of faith is fear. Now, sometimes we hear the claim that doubt is the opposite of faith. I'll maybe talk about that a little bit, but mainly the fear is immobilizing. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the unknown, fear of getting it wrong, making a mistake, fear of the unknown future, which is particularly applicable in war situations when people don't know the outcome of the war. Here in Australia in the Second World War, we faced the possibility of being invaded by Japan. And at that stage in history, Japan was a very barbaric nation. They had no sign up to the Geneva Convention, regularly tortured and killed captive prisoners, and was a really shocking kind of thing that happened to people. So the fear of invasion from Australia was great, and we were physically attacked in the northern parts of Australia by bombing, but we were never actually invaded because the Japanese were halted in Papua New Guinea along the Kokoda track, which is very, very important to a lot of Australians. But the fear of in war is significant. The fear of basically the unknown. How is this going to work out? All the things that we had in terms of our certainty of life, the good things that we had before the Second World War. Australia was on top in the cricket, playing against England. And during the Second World War, a number of our top players were killed. And the whole thing had to be restarted. And it was very, very much just a change the whole circumstances of life in which we face. So that fear of the unknown, the fear of the future, is something that is normally happens when a war breaks out. I had a good friend who's Lithuanian, lives in Lithuania. Actually, sorry, lives in Scotland, but is Lithuanian. And when the Ukrainian war broke out, her sense of fear of what would happen, not only to Ukraine, where she had a number of very close friends, but also if Ukraine fell, what was the future for her country? And the fear, and she was a Christian, and really deeply troubled by that. I think her faith helped her through a lot of that and move on from there. But fear is something that is immobilizing, is challenging in terms of what we do, and can cause us to become unwilling to step out in faith. But if you take it back to the local level, to the less less angry level than in a war circumstance, just our fear in normal daily life can stop us from doing things. Fear focuses our attention on our safety, what could harm us, and that is the opposite of faith. I often think of Peter stepping out onto the stormy waters when Jesus called him from the boat. For those of you who may not know, there was an episode where Jesus came walking to his disciples on the water. It's often a bit of a joke amongst non-Christians about walking on water, but that's the origin of the story. And Peter stepped out of the boat in faith. What happened then, of course, he looked around him, saw the raging storm, his faith dissipated, and he started to sink. But graciously, Jesus reached out his hand and lifted him up and saved him from sinking and drowning. So fear, even when we step out in faith, can be something that causes us to falter, to stagger, to stop. And that can be both at a personal level, but also at a church-wide level. I've seen organisations that have a massive opportunity to do something, but the fear of the financial cost and whether or not we're able to pay to do this can cause them to stop and really make a stop of God's provision, God's leading to be fully undertaken. I don't know if I explained that very, very well, but that's something that is a real shame, because it really closes the door and something could be very, very wonderful.
Yeah, I think that the way I heard that anyway, Steve, is this idea that we can very much get in our own way when we're invited to trust God and just see how big and incredible his plans and provision and protection are. And we can stop ourselves from accepting that invitation and just seeing how big our God really is. That's been my own experience in seasons where I've been in a state of crippling fear before. Is I've just it's almost like I've stood on the sidelines and watched what God could do, but I haven't been brave enough to step out onto the pitch. I'm using sports references, which I've never done. I've been watching too much Ted Lasso. But I think in seasons where I've stepped out in total faith, and I think of the fact that I've not shared much of my background on this podcast yet, but my story, just a tiny piece of it, is that I moved to the UK by myself at 18. I had some distant relatives on the other end who took me in, but I got on that plane and I did my first international journey with a bunch of suitcases by myself at 18 years old, and that was terrifying. And then the decision to stay, to move permanently, I'm so glad that I wasn't aware of all the challenges that I would face to do that, because I don't think I would have done it. I think the fear would have kept me from doing it. And that's an instance where I think, gosh, if I'd have looked at everything, you think of that scripture, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. This was God's mercy in my life that I didn't even know what tomorrow held. And thank you, Jesus, that I didn't know, because if I'd have known all the immigration struggles that I would have faced, the fear would have just taken me out. I would not have felt like I could do it. And that to me is one of my best examples. It's like a reference point for me of, look what fear could have done. By God's mercy, you weren't actually allowed to feel the fear until you were in those situations where the immigration hurdles came up. But if you'd have known, if you'd have tried to work it all out, you'd have been so fearful, primarily based on the fact that you were trying to think it through as to how you could do it in your own strength. And actually, at every twist and turn in my immigration journey, there were legitimate miracles that God performed to keep me in the UK. And if I'd have known all the hurdles ahead of time, of course I wouldn't have conceived of God performing miracles. I would have only been thinking, how can I do this? How can I do this? And so the fear could have taken me out, and then I wouldn't have been able to see just how much God did in my life.
Yeah, I think you've hit it nail right on the head, Christina. That is very much where it's at. If we know the future, which thankfully we don't, we may not do half the things that God called us into doing. I have another close friend who is a missionary in Papua New Guinea. He has suffered a home invasion up there, and his actual life and his family were threatened. If he'd have known the impact that would have had on his life, he may never have gone. Yet he stays up there. He still continues to minister up there. He still continues to live in faith. And that is all because he trusts God, and God brought him through that, and he's not prepared to let the fear to be the thing that rules his life.
Yeah, and I think that your example is much closer to the content of Screwtape's letter, because mine was hard, but I still at no point was facing any sorts of fear of home invasion or having to kill someone or being killed. And I don't want to downplay the intensity of what Screwtape's actually addressing, because this is people's lived existence even now. And I want to go into sort of the next section of this letter, because there's so much that we could talk about for ages and ages, and I want to move along, but it feels like this is a good time to transition. So the next thing I kind of wanted to look at is, when faced with the reality of death, we discover this true longing for eternity, I would say, and by extension for God. There's a scripture in Ecclesiastes that says that God has planted eternity in the human heart. And I know I've had friends who, when a loved one passed away, these are atheist friends, they've come to me and said, "You're so lucky to believe in God. I wish that I could believe in God, because this hurts so much. This death, this loss hurts so much." And it's interesting to me, because I see in that statement that they can't just give into their instinctual nature to recognize that death isn't natural. That's how I think of death. Is it's not actually, it wasn't God's original plan, right? The fall brought death into the story. I'm using a little bit of Christianese here, guys, but the fall is essentially the story in Genesis of when sin entered the world, and death by extension, to exterminate sin, because sin was separate from God's purity, separate from goodness. It was evil. It was going to harm his creation. And so in order to have a just penalty for sin and to essentially exterminate it, death also came in, and sickness, and all of the elements of our brokenness came in when sin entered the world, when a human performed a sinful act. That's a really overarching, sweeping statement for, I'm doing like really intense bits of theology in like 30 seconds, but with the fall, death entered, which implies that death wasn't part of the original plan. And I feel that my family has had at least one family death for the last 5 years. And so every time we lose another person, it feels like this physical tearing inside of me. It's visceral, it's fleshy. It's not just in my head or my heart. I feel the grief in my body. And to me, that's such a marker that death wasn't part of the plan. C.S. Lewis has this quote that I think works in a lot of contexts, where he says, if I find in myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most logical explanation is that I was made for another world. I think grief, the feeling of grief, is a desire for eternity that this world can't satisfy. And so when we're faced with death, we have an option to lean in to what that grief is telling us. And I'm going to see if I can flip through and find where Screwtape kind of talks about this, because when we know Jesus, when we know the eternity story, as I like to call the gospel, there is, in a sense, I don't want to say a lack of total fear in death. I know some Christians who aren't afraid to die at all. I find that weird. I'm a little bit afraid to die. I like being here. I like my life. I like my husband. I like being able to move around. And I don't like, as you said, Steve, the unknown, the fear of the unknown, because the one thing we know is we'll be with Jesus, but we don't know practically what that's going to look like. And it does scare me, but it doesn't scare me in a sense that I think I'm going to cease to exist. It doesn't scare me in a sense that I think I'm never going to see my loved ones again. I have so much peace and faith in that. And I've just found the quote as I've been chatting to you. So Screwtape says, men are killed in places where they knew they might be killed, and to which they go, if they are at all of the enemy's party, prepared. And I think that's really interesting. And it's a marker of Christian faith that really sets us apart is that we can be prepared for death in a sense. And, I watched my grandfather pass away way too young. He was in his 60s and he had cancer. And it was a cruel and bitter death. Cancer is really, really cruel. But I was incredibly moved when I flew out to the States to say goodbye to him. And he was laying in his hospital bed and a friend of his from church came in and they just started praying in tongues. And there was this sense of hope that entered the room. And I just thought, like, this is the eternity story, right? What human could sit on their deathbed in a place of hope? And I love the sense that we can, in some way, whether we're in, a relatively peaceful journey towards death or a terribly violent one in times of war, that we can face death in a way quite prepared with a posture of hope. That's wild to me. That almost feels like blasphemous to my humanity that I can approach death with hope.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things that we have as Christians. I often finish emails that I send off with a wishing of peace and resurrection hope, because the big thing we have as Christians is the absolute certainty of our future because of Christ's resurrection, and that's so central, and that's what we base our times of grieving on. There's the hope that comes in the knowledge that Jesus rose again, and that he promises life to those who follow him as their Lord and Saviour. We live in a death-denying culture. We often hear the term death-defying, but I class it as a death-denying culture. We don't think about, we consider it morbid to think about death. If you wanted to put it really, really weirdly, you could say that people listening to this podcast, if the podcast goes for, say, 40 minutes, they have 40 minutes less in their life to live. Now, they don't know when that end is coming, but that's 40 minutes less of their life. We don't think in those sorts of terms. We have, I think, a subconscious way of living as though we have to live forever. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, we don't want to face death. But there's also, I think, inside us that sense that we are made for eternity, as you said. So that there's that natural tendency to think we're going to live forever when all I have another saying that life is a terminal illness. You don't get out of it alive. So please excuse my wicked, very sad sense of humour. But the truth is we don't. There is, for those who are Christians, the knowledge that one day Jesus will return, and those who are alive won't die. They'll be changed instantly to join him. But for the rest of us, we will die in some way or another. Sometime in the next 100 years, we will all die. And there's nothing we can do about that. And I'm not sure with the way things go on, we'd want to go on for too much longer anyway in our lives, because I'm nearly 70 now, and my health is not as good as it was when I was half my age at 35. So there's a definite experience that as you get older, it gets harder to do things. But the reality of death is something that we just put aside and don't think very much about. We regard it as morbid. For that reason, things like wills, putting down what we want done at our funeral, even things like putting our names down for organ donations, they're the sorts of things that are not in the forefront of people's minds. They don't think about those things. And there's a lot of people that die without having wills, without making their wishes known for either their organ donation or their funeral process, whether they want to be cremated or buried or whatever they'd prefer. And I think it's that denying culture that is what Lewis is trying to point out here. And it's where he gets into the comments about dying in a nursing home, where people are lied to, told they're going to get better when they're not going to, when they're in a hospital and they've got a terminal disease. I don't think it happens as much these days as perhaps it used to. But there used to be a real time when people were not told the truth of how long they had to live. And they thought that was wrong for some reason I don't understand. I wouldn't want to know that. If I'm going to get a terminal disease, I'd like to have an idea that it is terminal, and I'm not going to go beyond it. But to give people false hope is wrong when we have the real hope to offer people. So we live in this death-denying culture, and we then are tricked into not thinking about it. And that's where the comments in the letter basically talk about the nursing home. We mightn't think of it in those sorts of terms, but we have our daily responsibilities, whether that's our focus on football, entertainment, self-gratification in entire things that we enjoy doing, or perhaps it's preoccupation with problems, whether they're personal, like financial or worldwide problems such as climate change or political or social issues. Those sorts of things are those things that are things that keep our mind on the present, not thinking about the future. So what it is important to do sometimes to realise that we are finite. We won't live forever.
And that's such a hard... I've got myself muted while you're talking because I have a puppy downstairs that could start barking at any moment. But I was laughing really hard when you were like, we're all 40 minutes closer to death. And I'm like, oh gosh, like, what a morbid thought. But it's true, isn't it? And yeah, it's funny because my favorite letter from Screwtape Letters is coming up in a future episode, and it actually talks about being really present and how eternity is where eternity is in the present moment, essentially. The present moment is where eternity touches. It's not in our past, which is concrete and done with, and it's not in an unknown future. It's actually in the present moment. And so I'm constantly writing in the book club about how God walks in this tension between be aware of your future and also be really present. And only God can walk in those two contradictions perfectly. Only Jesus was able to do that. Because I always think, how was Jesus able to so passionately run his ministry for 3 years, knowing that he had a crucifixion at the end of the journey? Like, I'm anxious just knowing that I have my taxes to do at the end of the... Like, I don't know how people can walk in that present moment and also be aware of their impending, demise the way Jesus did. I don't do it. I can't do it very well. I often, like, we've got a will and everything, but I tried to get it written and finished as quickly as possible. I don't want to think about it. And when we're in times of war, when right now, like, our phones and screens are being flooded with images of war and death, like, and we're seeing... The last I saw, I know this is going to date this podcast episode, but right now it feels like I'd be remiss not to acknowledge what's going on in Gaza. And the last death count I saw was 14,000 dead, 6,000 missing. And there's a sinking feeling in my gut when I look at that number, because that number also is so high that it almost feels immaterial. It almost feels like I can't conceive of that much death. Like, myself personally, I can't wrap my head around that many lives changed, that many children lost, that many mothers lost. Like, I can't, my head explodes. And yet God sees it all, and he's in it all. And that feels like a really hard truth to also wrap my head around. And I think that our empathy, when we see those death toll numbers, to not only go out to other people's suffering, because that's how we are as humans, but also, again, faced with the reality of, what if I die? What if someone I love dies? It's really, I would say that's probably one of the most challenging questions that I'm always faced by atheists, is like, how can you live in a state of hope with the kind of information that you might see on that screen of 14,000 dead, 6,000 missing, that just causes that sinking feeling in your gut? How can you still live in a state of hope? I feel like I can't not address the question of, like, how can someone's faith grow, and how can someone's trust in a good God grow when faced with that kind of mass reality of death and suffering? And even going from the macro scale into the micro scale, like, seasons of suffering in our own lives, I think just highlight how personal, when we look at those numbers on a screen, that suffering is, how real that suffering is in someone else's life when we start to experience suffering in our own. And how does faith grow in that? How does a good God, reign supreme in that?
If we actually read the Bible, well, as Christians, it does not promise Christians particularly an easy, great, marvelous, fun life. There's sometimes along the lines you'll get all these things with persecutions. And I think that's what Lewis was getting at when he says that if all of the enemy's party prepared, in other words, those who are of God's family are prepared because they know that these things are part of their expectation as Christians. The voice of the martyrs throughout the centuries has been significant because that's the way that the church has grown. There's a old saying that the church was built on the blood of the martyrs. So all we can do is if we get to know God personally, which is what being a Christian is all about, then we can know God's heart of love. His desire was never for us to have suffering, never to have the kinds of things that are going on around in our world that have gone on for the millennia, that he himself entered into our condition and died as a human, going through all pain and agony to be one of us and not promising us anything different except that our life will be full, our life will be meaningful. It's not just pie in the sky. It's here and now that our life has meaning. One of the things I noted down when we're talking about this is in Psalm 90, verse 12, it says, "Teach us to use wisely all the time that we have." It's not just a matter of looking at it and saying, oh, it's terrible how everything in the world goes along. But the fact of the matter is God has given humans free will, and along with free will comes beyond the possibility, I've heard some people say, the necessity for people to disobey God, and disobeying God brings in all that evil, all that suffering. God is not trying to manipulate us into robots. Yes, he could theoretically step in and make everything well, but that does not give us free will. It eliminates our free will, and we'll become nothing more than robots. And his desire is to live in relationship with people who want to live in relationship with him. And that means trusting him. And that's where the faith thing comes out, and being able to step beyond fear. Because if we trust him and get to know him more and more, and get to know his love for us, the deep love that he has for us all, then we can trust him. There's a beautiful story just came to mind of, I think it's titled Footsteps. A person looks back over their lives and they see two sets of footsteps in the sand. When the waves got really rough and the hard times came, there was only one set of footsteps. And the rest of the story goes, the person turned to God and said, "Why did you leave me alone to walk through those hard times by myself?" And God says, "No, I did not leave you alone. I carried you." And that is the beauty of it. We may face these troubles, these persecutions. We may see all the devastation going around on us. But God walks with us and even carries us through the harder parts. I won't go into the details right now, but I've seen some fairly challenging times, not in the military, but in my own life. And I can say that God honestly carried us through those times. So that's a bit of an answer to what your question was, I think.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's such a prevalent question that I think every Christian and non-Christian asks. Anyone who's engaging the reality of a God asks that question, I think, at some point. And it's a consistently difficult one to answer, I think, only for the fact that, suffering is so poignantly life-changing for all of us. And I went through a season in my own life about 2 years ago. It was honestly one of the hardest times in my life. And I've gone through some really traumatic things, particularly in my late teens and my early 20s. And yet, about 2 years ago, I went through a season where it was the first time that I truly sensed the camaraderie between me and Jesus when he said, "God, where have you gone? Why have you forsaken me?" I felt God's silence for the first time in my life. And it was It was harrowing. It was empty. I felt I'm quite a creative, like full of life person, and I felt no luster for life. I felt no concept of meaning in life anymore. And this carried on for about 18 months. And my relationship with God absolutely shifted. I looked at God. I've known him so intimately that I couldn't just renounce his existence. There's a really funny quote by Donald Miller in his book, Searching for God Knows What. When he was a teenager, he decided that he'd only had faith because his parents had raised him to have faith. And so he went on a walk and he said, I told God that he didn't exist. And I always love the irony of that. It was so funny. But I've known God too intimately, and I've witnessed too many miracles, and I've sensed his presence to... I can't just renounce him. So instead of renouncing him in my suffering, I looked at him and I said, okay, I know you're real, but I don't know where you are. And I don't know how you claim to be good, but I don't know if you're good anymore. I don't know. I actually was as bold as to say, I don't know if I love you anymore. That was how raw and honest I got with God. And it was only because I've had such a long and intimate faith. I've known Jesus since I actually can't remember my conversion. That's how I'm pretty sure I came out of the womb knowing Jesus, and what a gift to say that. But I genuinely can't remember coming to faith. I've just always known Jesus in my life since my earliest memory, which is probably about 2 years old. So I've known him long enough, and I've got enough intimacy with him that I was unashamed to say, I don't know if I love you anymore. I can't renounce my belief in your existence. I can't renounce my belief in your son, but I can say that I don't know how much I want to talk to you. I don't know how much I want to be around you. I feel, like that Footsteps poem. I remember the first time I read that poem. If most Christians, I think, will have come across it at some point. I felt completely the indignation of why are my footsteps the only ones in the sand? And I did not feel carried. I felt abandoned. And yet I knew that God is honest, and he makes the claim that he is good. So I had to basically start with that assumption and work my way backwards. So I'm like, I don't feel that you're good. Nothing in my life seems to show that you're good. And I know that we're always very short-sighted. So I can look back now and see God's goodness in that season. But in the moment, you don't see God's goodness. So I had to basically say, right, I'm at point A and God's goodness is over at point B. And I have to figure out why that's true. Because for my own academic mind, like, God made me to think this way. So I believe that he will indulge my curiosity and he will meet me in my questions. But I have to ask them, and I have to actually work to find the answers. And during that time, I picked up a book by Pete Greig called God on Mute, which is essentially, it's honestly, in some ways, I would say that saved my faith, because it's about engaging. I think the subtitle of it is Engaging the Silence of Unanswered Prayer. And he shares his story of him and his wife walking through her journey of epilepsy and the seasons that she nearly died, and they were a young couple, not far off the age that my husband and I are now, and new parents. And it was so raw. It was not, there was no Christian fluff. There was no, we're all promised suffering, so just rub some dirt in it and suck it up. There was none of that. It was, no, this is agony, and where is God? And he takes you through the journey using the structure of the Easter story. And what I found in that, and I think you touched on it, Steve, is like, the more you know God, the more you can trust him. Like, the journey of the Christian is to know God well enough that when suffering comes, you know that he's carrying you because you've learned so much of his character. We always talk about having a relationship with God, and I think that can sometimes seem a bit vague, but we really mean it in the sense that you have a relationship with your spouse or your parent or your friend. It's a relationship that you build trust in. And so in this book, as I was reading it, I got to know God in a different way. And I'll always say this, most of my life, I've always felt closer to God the Father. And in this season, I felt closer to Christ the Son, Because as I learned and identified with the Easter story, I felt this intimacy with Jesus in recognizing like God came down as a man to sit in my suffering with me, and he endured it with me. And I might not be able this side of heaven to still understand fully why there is suffering, other than, we talk about free will, and I think that's a legitimate part of the answer is we suffer because God gives us the freedom to invoke suffering on one another. And that there is an element of that, but I think it's a fair question when people say, yeah, but why would God allow one child to hurt another child? I think that's a fair question. And I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that God honors me enough that he did not just sit back and observe my suffering. He actually stepped into it. He actually came down in a mortal body and felt not only the physical agony of capital torture in crucifixion, but he felt the spiritual abandonment of God that I was feeling in that season. And there was so much dignity that I discovered in that. I felt like God honored my suffering so much to say, I will sit in it with you. And I clung on to the scripture, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, because that was my biggest thing. As I was digging my heels in, I was like, we're promised suffering, but I refuse to allow suffering to be the end of my story. That isn't a hope-filled faith. And I remembered, Jesus in Gethsemane, sweating blood, begging God to take this cup from him, but then yielding to God's will. And for those who don't know the story, Jesus, the night before his crucifixion, he prays, God, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Don't let me be crucified, but if not my will, then your will be done. And he's begging to have the suffering taken from him, as any human would. And I felt so seen in that. I was like, I would choose suffering. I don't care how romanticized the sanctification of suffering story is. I wouldn't choose suffering. Like, if I could choose to live through life knowing that I'm never going to lose my mom to death, I would choose that. I don't care how much sanctification might come from the grief of one day losing my mom. I wouldn't choose that. And Jesus actually didn't want to be crucified, but he yielded. He yielded to God. And the scripture that says he yielded to God for the joy set before him. He endured the cross. And so as I was reading this book, and it took me through the Easter story, I recognized that, yes, I was in a Good Friday season. I was in a crucifixion season where all of my hopes were laid bare, and I was in so much pain. But that wasn't the end of God's story, and it's not the end of ours as Christians. I can't remember who this quote is from, but I always think back to it, and it was basically someone defining Christians as saying, we are the Easter people. We live in hope of the Sunday. We live in hope of the day that death is conquered. We live in hope of the day that joy that was set before him is all there is left. And at some point, I can't wait to get to The Last Battle from C.S. Lewis, because I think it's a beautiful picture of the joy that's set before each of us. And we each go through our Easter story. We go through our suffering multiple times. But the hope that we get to cling to is not only that we have a God who sees us and who loves us enough that he actually doesn't just observe us from a distance, but he steps into suffering with us. But also, he doesn't patronize us by just saying, you've got to suffer to be sanctified. He actually goes one step further to say, this is not the end. That C.S. Lewis quote again, if I find in myself a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most logical explanation is I was made for another world. We have a desire for a world without suffering, and God will satisfy that desire. I believe that with my whole heart. And that season of suffering that I went through a few years ago, when I came out of it, all it did was serve to further intensify me digging my heels into the hope I have in eternity, and the hope I have for that same joy that was set before Jesus before he endured the cross is the same joy that I press on in my race for the rest of my life. I will endure Good Friday seasons, but there will be an ultimate and final Easter Sunday that nothing can take away. And that, again, feels like a wild and blasphemous thing to say unless you've known God so deeply. And so I think you really touched on it there, Steve. Like the key is knowing God and engaging with him and his character in whatever way he's wired your brain to work. So for me, it was very structured out like an academic, right? God claims he's good. So how do I know that? And I did the research like I would writing an essay, but God met me there. He wired me that way. So he met me there when I reached out in curiosity. And that was faith. That was faith over fear. And I felt fear.
Yeah.
I felt so much fear during that time. I remember once, like, just a series of things went wrong in mine and my husband's life. We had multiple family deaths. We had some financial disasters. COVID was happening. All this stuff was happening. And I remember getting in the car every day afraid that I was going to get in an accident. I remember every time the phone rang, I was afraid that it was going to be a call that my mom had passed away, because I just had this fearful anticipation of the next thing going wrong. And yet over that fear, I kept stepping out and saying, but God told me he's good. So I've got to find my way back to that conclusion. And that little willingness, that tiny piece of me that was willing to ask questions, was choosing to act in faith over just the fear that was crippling me.
Yep. That's Christina, what you've shared is just absolutely wonderful. And that's so true. It's the stepping out in the faith when the fear is great. That's just the truth of it. And yeah, I don't think I can add much more to that, but it's just that hard times. I hope I didn't sound like I was being patronising in any way, shape, or form about what what it's like going through, because it's hard. It's not. I wouldn't choose suffering. I hate it. But it's only in hindsight sometimes, and sometimes hindsight may be in the eternity sphere that we'll understand some of these things. But it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on to the last part of this letter that we wanted to address, which I think touches a lot on your personal experience as well. And essentially, I found this such a fascinating part of Lewis's letter. And I would also really relish any theological insight that you have on this, having gone to Bible college. Let me grab my copy. So there's a section in here that basically highlights God's mercy, specifically in the context of times of war, times of like global or national suffering, where people are called to focus on purposes higher than themselves, called to jump into higher causes. And I'll just read the quote because I'm botching the explanation. So it says, "We may hope for a good deal of cruelty and unchastity, but if we are not careful, we shall see thousands turning in this tribulation to the enemy, while tens of thousands who do not go so far as that will nevertheless have their attention diverted from themselves to values and causes which they believe to be higher than the self. I know that the enemy disapproves many of these causes, but that is where he is so unfair. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad on the monstrously sophistical ground that the humans thought them good and were following the best they knew." So this idea, essentially, that God is so merciful that he recognizes our finite understanding of things and honors our hearts in our efforts. And I think this has to be contextualized in the topic of war, because when we're talking about war times, people are naturally going to understand, often from the context of their own nation and, you know, what's being shared through their nation's media streams, you know, and this is in the topic of the Second World War. There was so much propaganda on the German side, you know, and so there were people who, I have absolutely no doubt, were going to war genuinely believing they were going for a good cause. But this whole concept feels in direct conflict with that whole quote, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," which I've heard growing up. So what theology backs up this concept that God sees us in our finite understanding and like honors and loves us even basically in our stupidity when we're doing the best we know, but we don't know very much?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of that, Christina. The question of who's in and who's out is one of the ones that's always challenged me throughout my years. I grew up in a very strong, almost fundamental evangelical world where we were taught that if you don't become a Christian and you die tomorrow, you're out, you're not getting in. And that was, I think, based on the Hebrews 9:27 verse that says, we die only once and then we are judged. And the challenge there is that I was taught that once you die, you don't have a second chance. That's it. So we've got to go out and we've got to preach the gospel to those around us to give them the chance to get into the kingdom. And how does that affect those that never have a chance to hear? How does it affect unborn babies? And probably one of my most interesting challenges is when part of my studies, I went to a Jewish synagogue for a Jewish bat mitzvah. And the sudden realization that these people were worshipping the same God that we worship in their understanding. They did not accept Jesus as Messiah. Did that mean they were out? Yet they were still worshipping the God that we worship. I know that, to me, I sat back on my haunches and thought, now, how do I deal with this? One of the things that you spoke about the last battle a few moments ago, one of the things as a young fellow I found very, very interesting was the story of the dwarfs in the stable. Now, just a bit of background to it. They had done some things that were not good, and they were sitting in a stable drinking wine, but they actually thought it was just water out of the trough that the mule had been drinking out of. So that didn't taste very nice to them, but it was apparently very, very nice wine that they were drinking, but they didn't realise that. And they only saw the walls of the stable. They did not see beyond the vista that was opening into the bright new world of the future. And Aslan, who is the lion, the sort of metaphor for Jesus, describes their plight. Their prison is only in their minds, yet they are in that prison and are so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out. Now, I know we can't develop theology from a work of fiction, but this helped me when I was a young man to think about the dwarfs were offered mercy, but their skepticism kept them in the stable. And the sort of realization that people choose eternity with separation from God. The medieval view of hell sometimes distorts our view of that, but I believe they were trying to describe in some way that we'd understand what it feels like to be separated from God. And, somehow feel that these people will go on refusing to accept what God would offer. I'm not sure, and I live in the uncertainty of how that'll all work out and whether that's going to work at all. I'm still stuck with my old-fashioned King James translation. It says, it is appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. But by the same token, what I've come to do is to let God decide. We can't decide who's in and who's out. And I wonder whether this is Lewis's way of saying, look, there are people out there whose hearts God understands because of their upbringing, because of their lack of any kind of option, or maybe they had an option to accept an evangelical type of faith, and they rejected it. God deals mercifully with them. And, the Psalms say that God, the Lord, is merciful, is kind and patient, his love never fails. He understands where people are coming at. And that's where my thinking went when we talked about that. I don't think it's a purely adequate version. I'd probably get kicked out of some churches by even thinking along those lines. But nevertheless, all I can hang on to is as you get to know God, get to know how merciful he is. And by the way, I had a very, very well-read lecturer, professor, when I was studying, and he believed in the ultimate salvation of all people. I can't believe that because I don't see that's what the Bible teaches. But there is a spectrum of belief on that regard, and it's not as clear-cut as I was led to believe as a young person growing up, that it's you're either in or you're out, the very black and white point of view. And I think if we just now step back and allow God to choose as God knows best, that's my best way I can look at what Lewis has said here.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite parts of the last battle, and that scene continues when the main characters step through the stable door, and they see people stepping through and creatures and animals stepping through who they weren't expecting to step through as well. And it was so interesting because obviously I know this isn't scripture. I know we can't base this as like our theological foundation, but there was such a sense of relief that washed over my spirit when I realized that I actually don't have to sit in the judgment seat and look and assess who is going to step through that door. And just to be really crystal clear, the metaphor here is basically stepping through into eternity with Jesus into heaven. That's what the stable door is representing in the last battle. But Lewis is saying essentially, like, you will not know who's going to step through because God knows the heart of each man and woman better than you ever could. And that was so comforting for me, particularly when there's been, like I said, we've had so many deaths on both sides of the Atlantic. I've had family members and my husband has had family members who have passed. Just so much death in the last 5 years. And so many people who I have loved who've passed away, I don't actually know where they stand with God. I don't have a clue. And there was such a relief, like this burden taken off me when I realized I don't need to know because my perfectly just and perfectly loving God knows. And that doesn't, I think that, because I was also raised in the early church I grew up in. My mom didn't raise me this way. My mom was very countercultural. She would often teach me things in the home that were a little bit more, well, like you said, you might get thrown out of certain churches. I think if she'd have shared this in some of the churches we attended as I was a child, she might have gotten chucked out as well. But it kept me really grounded. In church, I was taught very much the same as you, that people had one shot, and they had to be self-declaring Christians with faith in Jesus Christ before they died, or that was it. They were done. They weren't part of the club. That's what I was taught. My mom at home always told me something different. She said, call me crazy, but when Jesus was on the cross, he said, "It is finished." That's a very final statement. He didn't say it is finished if every single person comes to me in the Western evangelical way that is described in your church. He said it is finished. That battle against death, that price paid to win us into eternity, it's done. That was a victory cry on the cross. Now, I don't know if my mom necessarily believes or was trying to define like ultimate salvation. And to be honest, I don't know where I sit on that scale. But what I do know is there is so much more power in what Jesus did on the cross than I think that we allow in our evangelical teachings sometimes. And I don't actually need to look at someone and determine their salvation. And thank God that responsibility is not on my shoulders. What I do feel is important, and I think when you've got a church that might like chuck you out at the thought of even listening to our conversation, is when we think that, oh, that means that we don't really need to be fervent in sharing the gospel with people because everyone's going to come to faith in some way or God's going to save everyone. So in no way do I take this as a free pass to not share the gospel with people, but I share it with a different motivation. I don't share it with this fear that the person I'm talking to is going to go to hell if they don't listen to me, because I don't get to decide that. I don't get to know. What I do share it with is this motivation that I see it almost like Wizard of Oz. Like they're seeing the world in black and white, and I have these glasses that put everything into this like radiant, vibrant color. And why wouldn't I want someone else to see the world with that level of beauty? Why wouldn't I want someone? It's not loving to walk past them and not even offer them the glasses to see in color. It's not an act of love to deny them the chance to know how much more beautiful life is with Jesus. And that's where I got the title of this podcast. When they say, even I never dreamed of magic like this in Chronicles of Narnia, I actually believe that like if there's any definition of real magic in this world, it's the power of Christ on the cross and the Holy Spirit working alongside us in our daily life. It's his pure magic. And why wouldn't I want to share that with everyone? But what a relief that I don't have to look at someone at the end of any conversation where I share the gospel with them and assess whether or not I was successful in bringing them into a secret club. I don't have to have that pressure. And it also allows a lot more of authentic conversations with people. So I can see what you're saying here in this part of the letter, just in the sense that I think that Lewis is basically making space for God's infinite understanding in compared to our finite understanding.
Yeah. And a couple of things I'd add to those who are listening to this who have not made any perhaps decision to want to be in relationship with Jesus. One of the things is still don't take a risk, look into it further. But secondly, it's not just for the future, it's also for this life now, here and now. We've shared a lot on this podcast about the traumas that we've been through, and I only just touched on the surface of a couple of them. And if our life, well, I've been involved in my sister-in-law's funeral in the last 3 weeks. 64, died of very suddenly. And if it hadn't been for her faith, I don't know where we would have stood as a family in terms of being able to cope with that situation. So I understand what you're saying about having to be through funerals. And at the same time, I don't fret, as a friend of mine once did, about his father's salvation because he hadn't made the decision, in inverted commas. So it's a matter of leaving that side of things with God, to pray as we can. But if you're thinking about it and not sure about it, that God doesn't matter, God will give me a chance later on anyway, don't take that risk. Anyway, but it's too good. It's too good now, in the here and now, to knock it back. It's not all beer and skittles, as the saying goes. It's not all wonderful, but in terms of everything going right, that's not what God promises. But He does promise fulfillment, joy, peace beyond understanding, and a meaningful life that just cannot be even imagined, as you say, as a magic kind of life that we have to share.
Yeah. And we've only got a few minutes left, but I did want to touch on this as we finished off. I obviously wanted you on this episode very specifically because of your background, both in theology and your military career. Coming back to this theme of God developing our faith when faced with times of war, conflict, the reality that we die and sometimes in violent ways. Can you just give a snapshot of how you've connected with God through His mercy, through His goodness, through His perfect grace and judgment and all of those things, whilst in a career that very much did highlight the reality that lives have to be taken?
Yeah, it was something I had to think through very, very carefully. Was I prepared to be part of an organisation whose overall role was to kill people and break their stuff? That's fairly black and white. But that's what military organisations are there for. But it's not just in terms of doing that for the sake of doing it. We're not out to kill people because we want to. More, it's about, and particularly in the Australian sense, in my early career, it was all about trying to defend those who were weak and who were, as it says in Isaiah and James, defend the widows and orphans and help those in need. It was very much being in a position where those who were being oppressed, we could stand against those, much like police are needed in our world today to, if necessary, take lives in order to protect lives. It's a sad situation that is a necessary thing, I believe, in a world that is so full of evil and people doing evil things, that people who are vulnerable need to be protected. And that's why I was always proud of our Defence Force, not only having a role in a military sense, but also in a humanitarian aid sense. The work that we did in many places, from cyclones through to earthquakes, through to various things like peacekeeping missions and those sorts of things, that's something I was very, very proud of. About the one downside was when the war in Iraq came along, there was invasion in Iraq. I never agreed with that. I thought that was wrong. But there is also a sense that once you sign up as a military person, you sign an oath to do what you're told to do. And that's a hard thing sometimes. There are very clear direction as to what were just and unjust orders. There were orders that you didn't have to obey. If you were told to kill an innocent person in front of you, you did not have to obey that law because that was an illegal order. That was actually illegal, legal orders and illegal orders. Yet at the same time, I could be ordered to make sure an aircraft was worthy to fly where it could go out and bomb a town where I knew people was going to die. That was legal because that was in a military operational sense. Very hard to come to terms sometimes with those things, but things I had to deal with in my Christian walk in that regard. But it was very much about the need for protection of people who needed protection. That's probably a very quick way of summarising.
And that feels like what Lewis addresses a little bit when he talks about people going beyond their own personal causes to identify with higher causes, and God seeing our hearts in that and where we stand, and we're all just doing the best we can with where we're at and what we've got, and I think God's in a broken world and God sees that. But Steve, thank you so much for your time. I do just want to finish by, I want to acknowledge I really, really understand how privileged we are to be sitting comfortably in our homes discussing this theoretically when this is a very real thing that people are facing, like right this second as I talk. And again, like I feel this hit in my stomach just when I think about it. So I just want to acknowledge and honor that we are very, very blessed to be able to talk about this in theory, but God sees it in its reality. And I genuinely believe that he sits with us in our Good Fridays, in our pits, in the deepest form of suffering. I mean, Jesus had nails put through his wrist on a cross, and God understands that suffering so much better and practically, not just theoretically like we're discussing now. And so if you're in a season of suffering, or if you're feeling really grieved by what's going on in the world right now, I just want you to know that God sees you, and he does not balk at your grief. He understands it deeply. And I just pray that you would come to know him in that. Thank you so much, Steve. I've really enjoyed our chat. Bless you.
Bless you too. Thank you.
Wow. So there we are. I cannot express enough how grateful I was that Steve joined me from Australia to chat through some of these things. And you'll have noticed with the time difference, he was a lot more on the ball than I was. I was up early and tired, and my brain was buffering for the first sort of half an hour of our chat. But I really was grateful for the insight and the background that he brought to this particular letter, and I really hope that you did too. As always, if you've been with us for a little while, you know that I like to finish out each episode by reading a psalm. And after the heaviness of this episode, and again, I know I said it in my chat with Steve, but I really want to acknowledge that these are not just theoretical concepts, but suffering, and particularly if one is suffering on a scale which threatens their life and the life of their loved ones, is not something that I want to downplay in any stretch of the imagination, nor do I want to ignore the fact that I am speaking from a place of comfort and safety, and there is a certain element of understanding that I simply won't have, I can't have, and I honor those who have experienced it, who are experiencing it, and not trying to speak with any form of patronization, any form of supposed insight that is actually just hubris. So in the spirit of that, I want to end just with a psalm. This is a psalm of David. It's Psalm 63. And I just want to tie back to something that I can speak to, something that I do understand, which is this desperate desire for the goodness and hope of Jesus, even in my times of grief. So this is Psalm 63. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you. On my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your right hand upholds me. Be blessed, everyone. We'll catch up next week. Take care.